Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening as well. The traditional greeting on these webinars that we hold. This is Joseph Tripasani from Worldwide Markets and FXG. I thank you for attending. Today's topic was going to be, what's the future of the euro? And it is going to be, what is the future of the euro, but it's going to be expressed through the French election and what has actually taken place. It would be very hard to avoid. I know I've focused a lot on the French elections the past couple of weeks. And we have one more week to go, or 2 more weeks to go. But there's really very little else of equal importance, at least in potential, going on in the currency world and the world economics and international politics world right now. The chart you're looking at is a sigh of relief. It's a 5-minute chart, nice gap, 107.20 to about 108.50. That's more than a figure. Gap on the open in Asia, New Zealand, Auckland, and Sydney last night, if you are in New York as I am. A huge sigh of relief. Surprisingly, at such a big move for a gap of figure is a pretty decent size, you got a result which was totally expected, which gives you an idea of the amount of fear that was inherent in the markets, because the possibility was that the runoff, and it seemed, given the current sort of emotional political situation in much of the industrial world, in the recent history that we all know in the UK and the United States, with the seeming late surge of Mélenchon, the far left, or at least the leftist candidate, who has a decidedly anti-EU cast, although from a different point of view, in that he was campaigning on renegotiating some of the basic EU treaties, certainly the EMU treaty, the Maastricht treaty, which led to the creation of the euro. So even though this result was as predicted basically in every poll, not this result, but I mean the polls, the runoff between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron was predicted by every poll. In fact, the totals that they've received was also predicted quite accurately by almost every poll. So even though we got a completely expected result, and normally when there's a lot of volatility and a lot of question and a lot of interest going into an event such as an election like this, and you get a completely expected result, you normally get an example of the old cliche, buy the rumor and sell the fact. We did not get that this time. What we got was basically a relief rally in the euro. Because even though the odds seemed against two anti-EU and EMU candidates, meaning Marine Le Pen and Mélenchon, the amount of fear, dislocation, and volatility that would have generated. Now we're supposedly on a smooth glide path to the status quo. Emmanuel Macron may not be, well, what he has done in forming his own party about a year ago was brilliant politically. He looked at what happened in the UK, looked at what happened in the United States, and very sensibly noted that there is an enormous anti-establishment. In France, they call it the oligarchy. Here we call it inside the Beltway. In UK, they probably call it the elites in London. Whatever you want to call it, there is a huge vote against that waiting to be tapped. It is what elected Donald Trump against all odds in the United States. In fact, Donald Trump's odds, if you go back a year and a half before the US election, were far greater against him than anything that has taken place in this election. Even Marine Le Pen's say she wins would be of less note in a sense of where it came, where she came from. She's an established figure in French politics, has been for years. The party was founded by her father, who actually ran for the presidency 15 years ago in 2002. He was trounced, I believe, by Jacques Chirac, 82 to 18. My guess is Ms. Le Pen will do better. Ms. Le Pen will do better than that now. So Donald Trump's rise to the presidency is even more far-fetched than that. So the potency of the coalition, the emotion that he saw and called into political action was noted by Mr. Macron. Now, Mr. Macron is hardly, he is young, he's 39. Anybody younger than I am is now young by my own definition. Again, let me just mention housekeeping, the details. If anyone has any comments or questions, please type them into the chat. Adinda, could you send me the link to the video chat so I can see it? I don't have it. And I'll be glad to stop and answer them. We're going to be talking about the euro and about France, but here we go. Chat is now up. So if you have any anything you'd like to add, please type in chat. By the way, I'm sorry we got started a little bit late this morning. The old phrase, stuff happens. And I apologize for it. Mr. Macron has had a meteoric ride. He's only 39. This is astonishing. He would be the youngest president of France in history if he wins the election, as everyone at this point expects him to. Even if Marine Le Pen improves tremendously, even if she doubles her father's vote 15 years ago, it would still be a 60-40 election. So we shall see. The French election campaign to the runoff is only 2 weeks. It took Donald Trump a year and a half almost, well, a year, to run the United States, to get to the presidency. The campaign in this condensed fashion does very much favor the establishment candidate. I believe this particular runoff system is designed to do that, and it does do it. Mr. Macron is not an outsider to French politics. He was Bernard Hollande's economics minister. He was in the government. He may be very young, he's by all accounts a brilliant man. He's quite charismatic. He makes a very good appearance in that great medium of television, and he is clearly an astute politician. Bernard Hollande is a socialist. The socialist in this last election got 7% of the vote. Mr. Macron could easily have led that party. Very wisely, he chose not to. This is a time of discontent, at some levels disgust, with political establishments in many countries. It is not simply in the UK that voted roundly against the elites in London. It is not simply in the United States, which voted roundly and very unexpectedly, as in Europe, as in UK, against the elites in DC and the media elites in both coasts. Clearly, I mentioned this statistic before about the United States. If you took away the over vote, the margin from California, I think it was about 3 million votes, from the national election, and you made California run 50-50, then in the rest of the country, including the East Coast, Donald Trump won quite handily the popular vote and the electoral vote. That, of course, does not mean that Donald Trump won the popular vote. He did not. He lost it because, but it gives you a sense of what the country as a whole is actually thinking, as opposed to the very skewed voting population in California. Okay. The markets breathed an enormous sigh of relief this morning. This is one huge sigh. The other was the essential collapse in the credit spread. I think I have the figures here between the German, the French 2-year and 10-year. I think I have the figures here. I do. So you saw about a 40% collapse in the risk premium that had been given to various French credit instruments this morning, because after all, it did look like Mélenchon was surging. And really, now there's many, actually 11 people, but 5 main people in the campaign. It came in about 19%. So well, it would have taken quite a bit, but in absolute terms, it wasn't very much. 5 or 6 more percent for Mélenchon. You would have had a runoff between Marine Le Pen and Jean-Luc. Is it Jean-Luc? No, is that Jean-Luc Picard? I'm thinking of, I'm afraid. Mélenchon. And that would have been a nightmare for the markets. You would see the euro, if that had been the result, my guess is you would see the euro 104.50 right now, or lower. But that did not happen. So you had this huge relief rally, both in the euro and in the credit spreads. French returns, French bonds went up, and French returns came off, and that closed by almost half the gap that had been there with the German credit, just that particular. So we have this idea that the euro has been saved, that the European Union has been saved. Does this look like a savior? It does not, and I'll show you why. Let's take a look at a much longer euro. This is a 5-year euro chart. 5 years. Okay, 5-year euro chart. Now remember the assumptions that are involved in this chart. The assumption everywhere right now is that Emmanuel Macron will win handily. 60% of the vote or more. That's the operating assumption in every market right now. Well, if France not leaving the EMU, and if France not leaving the European Union, was the European Union's main trouble, then would you not have a much more substantial rally in the euro than you had today? And of course, what it is telling you is that the European Union's problem is not France, at least not specifically this election with the French threatening to create another revolution in Europe. That is not the case. European problems will continue. European voters' disenchantment in many cases, in many countries with the euro will continue. And in fact, I don't think this election does anything, provided of course Mr. Macron wins, except delay the inevitable, and it does something very dangerous. It will give the Europeans, the proponents, the governments, the journalists, and everyone who supports the European Union and the European Monetary Union a sense of ill-deserved relief. Because the issues will not have changed, but it will appear that the French electorate, speaking supposedly for the rest of the main European electorates, now remember the Continentals have always viewed Britain, and Britain viewed the Continentals as different species to some degree, to a large degree. There's that old famous headline from some British newspaper, I think, fog in channel, continent cut off. Or in the English-speaking world, it is the English Channel. Now, there's a good political reason for that, because it was a body of water and a military boundary dominated by England since the late 16th century, since the days of the Spanish Armada. That's a long time. So there's some sense of it being called the English Channel, because in a sense the English ruled that channel. And I don't know where that is now, but certainly up to the Second World War. And through the Second World War, that proved the case. Hence the name English Channel. So there is this sense in the euro, in Brussels, in all of the capitals of the monetary union and the European Union, that this election, if it comes out as appears that it will now, will have saved the European Union. And this is a very, very false feeling. The European Union and the euro cannot continue forever the way they are. You know, there's a very famous quote from Ferdinand Foch, the French general and field marshal, commander of the Allied armies at the end of in the latter part of the First World War. After the Versailles Treaty was signed with Germany, and I guess it was finally signed in 1921. Maybe it was 1919, one of the two. And he said, it's a very famous quote, "This is not a peace treaty, it's an armistice for 20 years. Now he was looking at that agreement as a military document. What he had wanted was a much harsher treaty, not economically, but militarily, and more so geographically. Mr. Foch, Field Marshal Foch, Ferdinand Foch, had wanted the Rhine as the French eastern border, noting that it was far more defensible. In fact, it was always the border of the Western Roman Empire in Northern Europe was the Rhine. And they held it right till the very end. And that was the border that he wanted. So when he said it was an armistice for 20 years, that's what he was referring to. Sometimes there's been so much commentary in the years since then that the economic clauses of the treaty were far too vindictive, and they in fact forced Germany into a second war to reverse the verdict of the first, at which they failed. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the problem with the Versailles Treaty, which was essentially vindictive and probably falsely so, was that it instilled a sense of, but not necessarily instilled, but was used as, by politicians later, as a means to gainsay the military result of the First World War, which in fact Germany lost. It may be because the United States joined it, but nonetheless, the Germans did lose the war militarily. They sued for peace. They were losing the war and would have lost the war with the occupation of Berlin, which basically happened anyway. But the real cause of the rise of fascism and other malignant, including communism, malignant political forces in Central Europe, certainly, was the Depression and the economic turmoil that it and poverty that it created, dislocation. So let us keep that in mind when we examine what has happened here. Again, I'm making the assumption that Mr. Macron will win. The polls are nowhere near as close as they were in the United States, and so I just don't think it's possible for Ms. Le Pen to overcome that kind of gap in 2 weeks. Remember, Donald Trump had a year traveling across the country to make his case, which was roundly ignored by the media, except for very few excellent journalists in the United States who actually are journalists. The rest of the media simply parroted the same line and sent no one out of the country, and apparently learned absolutely nothing about what was going on. And if I have some disrespect for these people who are supposedly practitioners of the art of reporting, that is accurate, because the reporting was woefully inadequate, and much of it remains so. There were, however, a few journalists, one of which I will mention, a woman named Selina Zito, whom I do not know, who was writing for the Pittsburgh paper, who was one of the few who actually did what journalists are supposed to do, which is go out into the country and follow the campaigns, engage what is happening, and talk to people. So credit to her. She's not quite famous, and she's deservedly so. The issues for the euro, for the European Union, for the European Monetary Union, are going to be covered over if this election transpires as it seems that it will now, if Mr. Macron wins. Mr. Macron is not from outside the establishment. Ms. Penn is. At least to the degree of it being a Paris centralized meritocracy rising through the French, which the French have a completely centralized system. So almost everything is national. It's far more difficult for within that system for a operator like Donald Trump to rise to the top. Britain has a surprisingly more decentralized system, although it is a much smaller country and centered, of course, in London. Its traditions are quite different. And so you could have a success of a campaign such as Brexit. So now we have, and why did I bring up Mr. Foch's quote? Not because his view of how to handle Germany after the First World War from a French point of view was correct or not. I will leave that topic to the historians for the moment. But because its analysis, its superficial, its surface analysis is correct, and it applies here. It was, in fact, an armistice for 20 years, almost to the year. And this election, if Mr. Macron wins, will not change the economic or political direction of France, and more importantly, of France and Italy and Spain and Portugal and Greece in the euro. It was funny when we, Martin Armstrong and I had, along with Ross Berland, in our panel last week, Martin said something I thought was very interesting. And that is, Ms. Le Pen would be the great hope for the euro, in the sense that it would force the euro and the European bureaucrats to realize what was actually going on. It would enable a soft landing, is what he said specifically. And it's a worthy quote. It's a worthy thought, because what it means is that the conditions that continue to drive apart the populations of the euro, the lands and people that are underneath the euro's, at this point, domination, would be made evident to the people who run the euro in Brussels and elsewhere if Ms. Le Pen won. Now, I encourage you actually to go to FX Street or to our website or Martin's website and listen to the whole panel. And you can listen to Martin's quotes and my quotes as well. It was an interesting topic, and it was a very interesting topic. And as the session went on, it tended more towards cultural explanations of the differences. So the euro's problem, and will the euro be saved? I frankly think that the euro will not be able to continue, will not last at the outside another decade, and I would say less, because it is not delivering, unless it has changed, prosperity and benefits to large sections of its population. And this is specifically the thing that Mr. Macron, who is a man of the establishment in Europe, he was Bernard Hollande's economics minister. He is not the man to reform, it seems to me anyway. He is not the man to reform the euro, to force a different way of using and a different purpose to the single currency. Again, the problem is, so you can see here, as I put on this chart, see, do we have this? Yes, we have this up. That the relief that we've seen, as I said earlier, is not telling you that this election was Europe's biggest problem. This chart, and this fall, of course, represents the diverging paths, among other things, of course, but the diverging paths of the European and the American economy, and also of the central bank policies between the ECB and the Fed. Well, the policies reflect the economies, so no matter how hesitant, if you will, and tentative, although maybe a little bit less tentative now, the Fed's policy of normalizing rates, whatever specifically that means in the context, it is telling you that at least the Fed is confident enough or fearful enough, but either way is willing to bring interest rates into a more historical context. It's certainly been my view for a long time, which people who come to these webinars have heard more than once, that in fact rates at this point after this amount of time are actually inhibitory for an economy rather than supportive, because what they do is they retard the necessary planning of businesses who might want to expand, and they provide support for businesses that are on the decline by virtue of being able to borrow very cheaply. It is the zombie company and zombie banks issue, writ small, as it has been writ large over the past generation in Japan. Zero rates do not create economic growth. They can't in theory, and they don't in practice. They stultify an economy. They turn it into a zombie economy. And this has certainly been evidenced in Japan over the past 20 years, and the past 30 years, actually. And it is becoming true here, and I think the Fed may realize this. Maybe they don't realize that they're all smart people. I'm sure they do to some degree. They're not going to talk about these things because that would be a criticism of their own policies. But it has to be evident to the people on the FOMC, voters and non-voters, and it is more than evident that whenever a recession comes, if the Fed wants to perform its counter-cyclical role, it certainly cannot do it from this level of the Fed funds rate. So back to the euro. So the sense of relief that has swept through world markets, and particularly continental markets, markets on the continent, at the results of the election, is nothing more in my mind than a delay. Unless the euro becomes an instrument for economic success in the majority of its nations and for the majority of its peoples, it is hard for me to see how it does not come to the same end, and this is not necessarily a comparison in the political system as the Soviet Union. In the end, the Soviet Union collapsed because no one was willing to defend it, or very few people. It continued long past its economic vibrancy. It continued long after its political vibrancy. At the end, almost no one really believed Marxist ideology, in the Marxist hope for the future, which was a live and emotionally supportive, if you will, ideology in the 20s and probably into the 30s and maybe more. I'm not a specialist in Russian history. But the euro is threatening to become the same type of dead weight that no one in the end really wants. And it is, of course, ironic that the fate predicted for capitalism under Marxist ideology, the withering away of the state, is almost exactly what happened to the communist structure of power throughout Russia and Eastern Europe. It simply melted away. Some of it was violent, but most of it was not. It simply disappeared and fell of its own weight because no one believed it anymore. The euro, I think, is looking four square at that future. And I make this prediction because we will see, I make this prediction because I don't see any sense of urgency or change. I thought for a while that the British vote might have shocked the Europeans, but that was a false notion because the Europeans and the British have never viewed each other as the same thing. And they certainly have never viewed each other politically or economically as the same thing. So it was far too easy for the Europeans to dismiss, after all, they never joined the euro, they kept the pound. It was far too easy for the Europeans to dismiss the vote as anything appropriate or any sort of commentary on the actual success of the euro, on the success of the regime and regimen of all of its permutations out of Brussels. Its economic content. And so they were both basically dismissed it. And so no notion of necessary reform to the euro and European institutions was taken, or has been taken, as far as I can see, from the British withdrawal. That would have been completely impossible, and perhaps still will be, if France or Marine Le Pen had won. Now, there is one caveat to that. Remember the last time Le Pen, I think, won about 22.5% of the vote. Macron about 24.5%. I think I didn't look at the latest numbers. So there's not much difference there. Between them, you're talking 45% of the vote, meaning 55% is going to come from somewhere else. When Jean-Marie Le Pen ran 15 years ago against Jacques Chirac, he got less than 20% of the vote. 18%, if I remember. 18 and 82, I think, were the totals. This is, of course, right after the euro started. The relief we have seen in the market. So it was not an astonishing relief. It was expected, but there was still a fair amount of relief. And I don't think it had to do with Marine Le Pen's vote. I think it had to do with Mélenchon and the French vote, and the idea that you would get two candidates who were either overtly or not quite covertly, but who considered that the euro is not the euro, who think that the euro and the European Union are not accepted dogma. Mr. Mélenchon wanted to renegotiate the treaties. My question has been, with whom? All 26 other members of the EU? How would that actually work? With the European bureaucracy in Brussels, how exactly would that work? So the idea was politically almost and practically, and I always thought, a non-starter. But it did express a real emotion and a real, I think, reflection of some of the very deep emotions in the French electorate. Politically, France has often led the continent. After all, the Enlightenment came from France. And its political revolutions over the centuries have often predated similar types of events and movements in other parts of Europe. Be that as it may. The idea that Ms. Le Pen represents 20%, more or less, of the French voters, French electorate, as her father did 15 years ago in the early glory days of the euro. Let's take a look. Where was the euro in 2002? Let's take a look at euro. This is a euro from 1980. So during that election, Jean-Marie Le Pen and Jacques Chirac, 2002. So right about here. The euro was even lower now, because the euro, that was right after the euro started trading retail, or traded 1999. It started, I believe it started right about here. Wait, 1999, we were right about here. That's right, that was year 1.18 was where it started, and then it came off over the next couple of years. But the euro then had not wreaked its havoc throughout European economies. I'm sorry, but that is what has happened. The benefits of the euro tended to be one-off, and the damage, both on the credit side, where everybody can borrow at rates they don't deserve, and on the economic side, where your products are still too expensive, had not begun to really take place. So 15 years ago, in the dawn of the euro era, Marine Le Pen's father made it to the second round of French elections, and as I've said, was trashed. Basically, 41. 80% for Jacques Chirac, 20% for Jean-Marie Le Pen. No matter how the percentages come out in this election, I believe that the press largely, and the Europeans, certainly the Europeans in favor of the euro and the union, will portray it as a victory, because it will in fact be a victory, assuming, of course, Macron wins. But there is a profound difference, depending, of course, on what happens, if Marine Le Pen garners somewhere upwards of 40% of the vote. If something like that happens, and I have seen no polls, so I really don't know. The one, I've seen some interesting speculations that certain percentages of each of the candidates who did not win, who they're going to vote for. Now, that's, in my mind, largely speculation. completely speculation, I guess largely, completely. And it showed that Ms. Le Pen would end up somewhere around 35% of the vote. Even that is a substantial change. And it's only 2 weeks, but we are about to find out the depth of the economic issues in France as a motivator for voting. And I can't really predict this. It is interesting that Ms. Le Pen, not interesting, but it's noted that Ms. Le Pen is using 2 of the same issues that Donald Trump rode to victory here: immigration and the economy. And the conditions are similar. France has always had a very, at least according to polls and others, a deep commitment to the European Union, and really up until very recently to the euro. Now, it is possible that Ms. Le Pen has been successful in moving her party away from its historical roots. It's hard not to view the Mélenchon vote, which was a little less than 18%, no, a little more than 18%, as a vote, in addition to other things, some are simply traditional leftists, against the euro. As I said, he advocated renegotiating the European treaties. I have no idea, and I'm not sure anybody asked what that actually means in reality, how you would do that. But it is more than possible that a good portion of his support is based not on traditional leftist prerogatives, but leftist prerogatives and considerations from an anti-EU, anti-Euro point of view. If that is the case, then some of those voters are going to vote for Marine Le Pen. If the other candidates, François Fillon, within the traditional breakdown of French political allegiance, some of that for each candidate, certainly the non-establishment candidates, Fillon being the most, but Hamon, Benoit Hamon, was clearly an establishment candidate, and actually the Socialist Party, in the person of Hollande, is running France at the moment. For whomever of those parties, those voters, the dominant emotion, the dominant consideration is economics or immigration, French culture, if you will, as Ms. Le Pen has represented. Those voters are going, or at least going to consider, voting for Marine Le Pen. So the result, meaning the percentages that Ms. Le Pen gathers in the final election in 2 weeks, will very much be a referendum on those issues. Whatever result there is, unless the election turns out to be very close or Ms. Le Pen wins, I do not see the euro and the European establishment that runs it changing its policies. So this election will be the armistice Ferdinand Foch spoke about, although for different reasons, after the Versailles Treaty was signed. The essence of the euro and the essence of the EU is a political contract. It is not an economic contract. It's a political contract designed to avoid, as I said last week, and a number of times that I've spoken about this topic, it's designed to avoid the horrors of the first half century of the 20th century in Europe, and much of the rest of the world as well, but certainly in Europe, as the primary originator of that conflict. Well, not primary, but not sole, because after all, Japan invaded China in the early 30s as well, and that war continued for almost 20 years, 15 years. So that political settlement is what the euro is designed to further. The euro was not designed with the idea of benefiting in some fashion or other all of its members and all of its population. It was designed to be the first tangible step, or a continuing tangible step, on the road to a political union, to a federal Europe. But as the most evident and tangible manifestation of that goal, the euro has become the repository for all of the things that are wrong with that goal and this method of getting to it. Now, I'm not saying that there is, from a European point of view, from a proponent of the euro's point of view, you could take a step back and say, well, this is all that could have been done. And that may be true. After all, politics is the realm of the possible. The ideal is the realm of philosophy and theorizing and ideology. And if Europe has had, over the past 100 years, too much of anything, it's probably ideology. But just the fact that it serves a noble purpose in the minds of its creators does not endear it necessarily. Ideology is thin gruel when the economy is not functioning. To put it dramatically, when food is gruel, ideology is not much of a replacement. You can't eat and drink and breathe ideology. At least most people can't. So this election in France is almost, in the old Russian phrase, a Potemkin election. It will appear to be a relief election, a endorsement of the European Union and the euro, the European Monetary Union. But I do not believe that will be the case, because the dislocations being caused, the economy and people's welfare, in their income, by the euro and by its inability to perform a beneficial function across the European Monetary Union, will not get better. I am sure that the EMU bureaucrats and elites in Brussels that formulate and run the euro, and with input, of course, from all of the political establishment class in the major European countries, will not take this opportunity to reform the euro. In whatever capacity they think that's possible, they will not do that. And if the current trends continue, now, there will be evidence of this. I could be wrong about this, but the evidence of this, I think, will be displayed in this election in 2 weeks. If Ms. Le Pen substantially improves on her vote total, her percentages, in the preliminary, if she improves upon substantially the percentages of her father 15 years ago against Jacques Chirac, then you will know that the economic issues in Europe, largely caused by the single currency, not completely, but largely, have become a dominating factor for a large minority of the population. The minorities, especially if this moves to 40%, I have no idea whether this will be or not. I'm assuming that her vote totals in the next election, the runoff, will be considerably higher than the 22.5% that she has gathered so far. The interesting thing will be that this isn't going to be the type of prolonged campaign that you see in Iceland, or you saw in the 15-year campaign essentially for Brexit. This will be a much more visceral and emotional expression of the French election, because it's only 2 weeks. If it turns out, let's put it this way, however this election turns out for Ms. Le Pen, I think and I predict that there will be very little change in the administration or the conceptualization of the euro. I think the die is cast. I'm not sure there's much they could do at this point anyway to reform the euro, but there are things they could do to reform and to lessen some of the antipathy that is felt in many sections of the European population to the European bureaucrats running the EU out of Brussels. However this election turns out, my prediction is that will not take place, and that the decline in allegiance and support for the euro continues to fall as the euro continues to damage prospects for large swaths of the European population. Okay, folks, I thank you very much. We will know in 2 weeks. I guess we'll have to do at least one more webinar and perhaps another panel on the French election. There's a lot of potential for interesting results. Again, I thank you all for attending. I thank FX Street for helping to put on these webinars that we do weekly. There will be another panel, another interview, market directions interview that I will conduct with Dion Raboin from Reuters. I think it would be interesting to look at, to listen to how the media assesses, gathers, and reports on market and market occurrences, the things that we read every day in Reuters is what we're going to be talking about. So I hope you all attend. It'll be 10 o'clock on Wednesday, same channel, same place. And I wish everyone a good day. Thank you for attending. Take care.